Ah, you know, fumbling for some explanation of this mysterious sense of self, said, I think, therefore I am, right, famously. But Satish Kumar, really, really interesting human being who uh, he was a person who undertook I think it was three major pilgrimages to the capitals of the countries at that time that had nuclear weapons. He walked all the way with nothing, just depending upon the goodness of other people. Anyway, he came up with a different proposition, which is this: you are, therefore I am. Now, look how that turns it around, you know. It's pointing to the fact of the mutuality of all life and of the fact that other life, other people, other beings bring us into being. You are, and my recognition of that is therefore I am, and constantly creates that sense of therefore I am. So this sense of self is constantly in interbeing, to use Thich Nhat Hanh's word. It's in interbeing. We exist in interbeing, not in singular, solitary, like a carapace of being. And so Zen has huge power to break that carapace open. And every koan works to do that, to take away that strange dream of I as standing alone.
Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. Today's episode is one that I had in mind when I first started formulating the idea for this podcast about 2 years ago, and that makes it a really fitting end to season 2 of the podcast. Dr. Susan Murphy Roshi is the founding teacher of Zen Open Circle in Sydney, Australia, as well as a writer, radio producer, film writer, and director. But I came to know her through two of her books, Minding the Earth, Mending the World, Zen and the Art of Planetary Crisis, and her latest book, A Fire Runs Through All Things, Zen Koans for Facing the Climate Crisis. In this episode, we talk about what a Zen perspective on the climate crisis looks like and the concept of engaged Buddhism, the interconnectedness of all things with a practice from Susan on how to help us recognize that connectedness, and her unique background that brings together Zen and Aboriginal teachings. This is episode 43 of the podcast. Can't quite believe it, but it's probably one of my favorite yet for a lot of reasons. The first being that a lot of my contemplation about our human relationship with nature, so the core idea of this podcast, actually came through my study of Buddhism and Zen. About a decade ago, I was lucky enough to be introduced to an amazing career coach named Michael Carroll, who was a high-flying human resources executive at a number of well-known companies, including the Walt Disney Company. But he was also an authorized Buddhist teacher who wrote the books Awake at Work and Fearless at Work on bringing Buddhist wisdom to your work and career. The short time I spent with Michael directly in person, and then the much longer time I spent with his books, fundamentally shifted my view of not just work, but how I engage the world around me. Susan's books have had a similar impact. The other reason that this is one of my favorite episodes is that it provides no answers. So you're in the wrong place if that's what you're looking for. The natural human inclination, I think, when faced with volatility and uncertainty, is to look for certainty, to look for the known. Often that results in nostalgia. Yet, to put it bluntly, what we know is not working for a lot of people right now, and certainly not working for the planet and the species we share the planet with. There are people who would like you to believe that the answer lies in domination. They're certain about it, in dominating and extracting from nature and dominating other groups of people. They like to say things like peace through strength and we're at war with nature, how ridiculous that is, and subjugating it for our own gain. I don't care for certainty, but I am certain that the notion that we are on this planet to fight it and every other living thing around us is absolutely ridiculous. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "Our life has to be our message." So as we wrap season 2, I'm really asking myself what I want my message to be about my time on Earth and my relationship with what lives and breathes here alongside myself. Without further delay, and with huge thanks and gratitude to Susan, here is the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with Dr. Susan Murphy Roshi, author of the new book, A Fire Runs Through All Things, Zen Koans for Facing the Climate Crisis. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are excited to be joined by Dr. Susan Murphy Roshi, Zen teacher, writer, and filmmaker. Thanks for joining us today, Susan.
It's my great pleasure on a very cold Australian morning here.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us all the way from Australia. It still feels like a little bit of magic when you're having these sort of cross-country, across-the-world recordings. So the first question I wanted to get into is sort of about the cultural perception of Zen. I think the way Zen is spoken about and talked about in popular culture sort of gives people an assumption maybe of a bit of detachment, sort of calm, relaxed, in your own bubble. So when you think about bringing like a Zen Buddhist, a Zen perspective to climate change, like what does that look like?
Okay. Well, it might look, if you were to look into a Zendo, in a room full of very quietly sitting people, the word detachment might come to your mind, but that is so not the reality. Inside that clear stillness and containment is something really quite contained and fierce. It's a fierce kind of practice. It's not detached in the slightest. So my position on this is that if Buddhism in any form is able to be or able to sit apart from the great issues of our day, especially, and most especially, the eco-crisis of our day, the global eco-crisis, then that particular brand of practice has reached its use-by date. It does not apply to what is of essential importance, what is happening, what is our shared reality, and how does a practice like Zen address that and embody it and move into it in a really fierce way. One of the things that really inspired me with the book, A Fire Runs Through All Things, inspired me enough to make it a kind of lead quote, was what Barry Lopez, very close to his death, wrote in a piece called Love in a Time of Terror. And he said this: in this moment, is it still possible to face the gathering darkness and say to the physical earth and to all its creatures, including ourselves, fiercely and without embarrassment, I love you, and to embrace fearlessly the burning world. So, Rick, that has been, that kind of energy and fierce protective love has been part of my Zen practice and my Zen teaching from the very beginning, all the way through. It is so remote from detachment. It's much closer to that kind of, if you've seen a mother lion protecting her cub from a marauding male lion, you will have seen extraordinary, fierce, protective love. It looks like rage. At the same time, it's so contained. It is so addressing this essential matter of protection of young, protection of the future, if you like. And that's bred into us. We're mammalian creatures. That is so part of us. It can be easily smothered and distracted and turned to trivial purposes, but it is there. And it is, from my point of view, it is essential that any kind of practice, especially Zen, because Zen Buddhism fell into a Taoist seedbed in China. And that's a very old earth-based philosophy, if you like, religious practice, understanding of how embedded we are with the earth and how, in a sense, we're here to think along with the earth. And so if to the extent that we're remote from that ability to think along with the earth, we're damned, in fact, right now as human beings. So that has been part of my writing, my practice, my teaching from earliest days, everything I've done. Very remote from detachment.
Yeah, I felt that fierceness come through when I was reading Minding the Earth Mending the World, one of your other books. I got that sense of immediateness and connection with the challenges that we're facing. And I think some people might be taken aback by that. But then when I started to look into practices like engaged Buddhism and how you're taking this sort of fierce protective love out of the meditation practice outside of the zazen or whatnot, like what does that look like for you? Like, how do you translate that sort of awareness with the challenges we're facing and that love and take that out into the world?
One of the immediate and sort of fundamental experiences of a practice, once it begins to deepen, a meditation practice, is that you begin to recognize that you do not end where you believe your body ends. You just simply do not. When you look for that sense of self, any kind of sense of a boundary to that softens and disappears. And so you begin to experience what is often called connectedness or interconnectedness or co-arising. Everything is co-arising. There is no way to step outside of that fact. Actually, an wonderful old Aboriginal teacher in Australia once said to me, Auntie Maureen, her name was, and Auntie Beryl, sorry, it was Auntie Beryl Carmichael, Auntie being an honorific title for an elder. So she just said these simple words. She said, reality is connectedness. If you are not in connectedness, you are not in reality. Now, that's a really kind of plain statement of the inarguable fact. Once you experience it, once it has touched you, you can't put it aside and go back to thinking, I'm inside here and that's outside there, and I have to look after this one. Self-protection is easy, usually relatively. That anger and protective kind of energy of self-protection is all too readily with us. But when that sense of self softens, that's when you begin to, in a sense, re-enter reality more fully, more completely. And it's alive. There's a great koan encounter where Zhao, a very, very old teacher, he would have been somewhere between 80 and 120 years old when he said these words. He was asked, what is meditation? And he replied, it's not meditation. And they said, what is it? He said, it's alive. It's alive. And when he says that it's alive, of course he's talking about meditation, but he's talking beyond that about reality is alive. And that is so much the experience when you begin to yield yourself in meditation, when you begin to, in a sense, concede reality in its much wider sense, where you end up in a place where you have the strong sense of all beings are one body. And so that protective care, that duty of care, is, you don't even have to think about it. It's natural. Any kind of quietistic practice that says, oh no, we don't get involved, we just sit back and we just become deeply peaceful and detached. That's, to use a technical term, Rick, that's bullshit.
Yeah, I love that. I initially came to Buddhism through a career coach that I had and applied a lot of the sort of lessons around things like right livelihood to my life and my career. And I think I got this saying, there's a point where I was actually fired from a job because I refused to work on an oil and gas company and in the consultancy that I was at. And I think I felt what you're referring to here, sort of when you feel this connection beyond yourself with these other living things, and extending that as beyond your skin, as you were mentioning. It almost seems obvious. Like, it almost seems like you don't have another choice. Like you already know instantly what you have to do in that moment, which is seems different than maybe some other philosophical or religious practices where it's not maybe quite as ingrained.
Imperative.
Yeah. Yeah. And in that same book, in Minding the Earth, Mending the World, you write, at the same time, we have to recognize the need for a common story that can help us understand and engage with the new reality breaking upon our heads. Do you have a sense of what that story is, or is there a story you're using?
What a wonderful question, and an impossible one as well. Because essentially this story is, like everything, is a co-arising matter. It has to be formed by all the energies on the earth at this time. However, story is so important because we do have we have a huge reservoir across the world in different places, it's going to be differently particular. But the mythic repository, let's call it that, or archive of myths, keeping in mind a myth is something that never happened and is always happening. So that's like a kind of psychic superstructure or psychic structure for ourselves. The myths actually give us, I would say, the container, the basis from which to really profoundly reimagine. Because this, in different measure, the same problems have beset us from the very beginning of human consciousness. The same problem of, who is this self? Is it somehow separate from everything around me? And where did all this amazing reality come from? And actually, what is it? I mean, that's what myth is addressing. And of course, it's so plain that whatever stories we tell ourselves are telling us who we are. They are defining and creating an imaginative space into which we can move. So coming back to that sense of fear's protective energy, that is what the new mythos of our time has to rouse and, in a sense, understand that, to put it really plainly, if we don't rouse this, we are cutting off the very branch we're sitting on. That's what we're doing. It's so plain. It's so plain to a child. And then as a child becomes older, they start to take on the sort of relativities of the world. And by the time they have a job or a family, or they have to remember to buy the milk and the bread that day or whatever, these are this deep, deep call of what really matters can fade. It's just not immediate enough. And so the mythos, the story stuff that we need to find, it's essential because myth is what keeps the human world, in existence in some kind of relatively congruent form, congruent with reality. That's what it's always trying to do, to bring us into congruence with what really is happening. So we can live as if immune from what is happening, whereas at the same time, right in this moment, the entire planet, for the first time in human history, is sharing one fate and knows it. I think you could also say it's from about the time those images of Earthrise over Moon, the first time that we saw, that's where we live. That's the place we all share. Also that Voyager image of the one blue pixel in the immensity of space, when Voyager cameras were turned back round to look back at the solar system, when it was way beyond the solar system, and to look back and try to see the Earth, and it was one blue pixel in the only blue pixel in space. Now that is such a striking fact. This is a living planet. It's so plain. How can that not call on your entire heart and imagination? That's the great mystery, actually, that it apparently cannot. We can live as though that is not the case. We're probably getting more and more remote from the power of the original oral storytelling that kept everything so strong within a community, because now it's separated by literacy, it's separated by screens, by digital reality, communication and so on. And then there's AI, and I don't know what to say about AI. Does anybody know at this point? So how much that's going to remove us from the immediate lived reality of the air we breathe, the earth we walk on, the warm blood in our bodies, the bones in our bodies, that remains the reality. So Descartes, fumbling for some explanation of this mysterious sense of self, said, I think, therefore I am, right, famously. But Satish Kumar, really, really interesting human being who, he was a person who undertook three major pilgrimages to the capitals of the countries at that time that had nuclear weapons. He walked all the way with nothing, just depending upon the goodness of other people. Anyway, he came up with a different proposition, which is this: you are, therefore I am. Now look how that turns it around, It's pointing to the fact of the mutuality of all life, and of the fact that other life, other people, other beings bring us into being. You are, and my recognition of that is therefore I am, and constantly creates that sense of therefore I am. So this sense of self is constantly in interbeing, to use Thich Nhat Hanh's word. It's in interbeing. We exist in interbeing, not in singular, solitary, like a carapace of being. And so Zen has huge power to break that carapace open. And every koan works to do that, to take away that strange dream of I as standing alone. If I can say one more thing, I'd say this. When I was very little, I think I was about 3.5, I learned to read because my sister decided she'd teach me everything she learned that day. So she came back from school and taught me to read. And I can remember sitting on the back steps of our house in Queensland, and the coolest place to be, reading a book, and I came across this strange capital letter I in the middle of a sentence. And I thought, that's weird, because capital's at the beginning of a sentence, not in the middle of a sentence. What's going on? What is this weird thing? So I took it to my father and said, what is this? What is this? And he said, that's you. And I can remember two things at once, Rick. I can remember feeling, wow, I stand alone. I have this capital I. This is so important, so amazing. And at the same time, I remember the world suddenly felt a little bit colder. Just suddenly felt a little bit more lonely, because children are so embedded in just what is happening. They do not see it as separate from themselves. I watched my granddaughter when she was much smaller, running down the beach, shouting out, I am the beach, I am the waves, I am the seagulls. She had no trouble recognizing that. But that singular I is really both the barrier to what we're talking about, and it's also the doorway through which we can walk.
When I think about some of the things that I've learned about Buddhism and Zen, like you just talked about the Buddha nature, the beginner's mind of children, of like being able to approach things and have a really wide aperture, see the connection, not be clouded by the world, as you said, the experiences. And then another key thing about Buddhism is sort of this reminder of our impermanence and like the impermanence of all things. And the world is in flux. And I always have personally a challenge when I think about climate change of sort of reconciling that impermanence and then what changes are going on. And maybe this stems from the disconnection of the I against the rest of the things that exist beyond my skin. But have you thought about like how to reconcile that embrace an understanding of the impermanence with just witnessing the destruction of life and feeling that fierce protective love to not want to like lose these species or have these wildfires take things out and change the landscape permanently. Is that something you've thought about or tried to reconcile?
Of course it is. Of course it is. It's impossible not to feel both and. Well, look, let's look at impermanence. Impermanence is the very material of being. You know, if there was no impermanence, you would still be, if you'd managed to get born, you'd still be a squalling newborn baby. You would not have become. Impermanence can also be described as one thing endlessly becoming another, becoming another, becoming another. Nothing is ever ended. Nothing on this earth can ever end, can ever say, that's come to its finish. And that is actually both a point of huge sorrow, because we love, this is a great koan-like poem, tiny poem, part of a poem actually, by Louise Gluck, who just asked these two questions. She said, why love what you will lose? And then she answered it with another question and said, what else is there to love? Now that's not just saying there's nothing else that we can find to love except things that will disappear. It's also saying this is the very dimension of love itself. So that sense of impermanence can be the monkey on your back, or it can be the endless creative opportunity, because everything is changing all the time. Whatever we think is a fixed matter is not. It's not. It constantly proves itself not to be. Now, when it comes to the loss of species, this is a grievous fact, because it comes back to us. It comes back to us. It comes down on us. And I hope it does come down on us with horror, because without the horror, you don't get the fierce protective love. That has to be aroused to come forward and meet the situation of where we are right now. So it is terrifying to think of our being the knowing cause of the sixth great extinction on Earth. The other side of that is life wants to live and will find its new ways to live. It will. It just will, with or without us. This planet is bursting with life. It's an astonishing fact that it exists. But then look at the fact that life comes out of it and keeps pouring out of it into every possible niche. Anything can become a niche for life. Now that's a very telling fact, and one that I take great heart from, because the sorrow is appropriate. The sorrow and the fear and the horror is appropriate. It has to reach us as a crime we share in, a crime that we share in. At the same time, there is a sense of the capacity, the endless capacity for life. We can also rely on that. It's in us as well. So what do we do with it? How do we contact it? How do we shape it? How do we, to use the words of Dogen, one of the great Japanese Zen masters, he was in his words of advice to the cook, very common, a very ordinary sort of moment, a beautiful piece of writing called Advice to the Cook, to be put into the kitchen of a monastery. And it said, turn things while turning with things. Now that's like saying constantly create, while moving with the forces of constant change. There's nowhere else to be. And so that's the place to look for the creative opportunities, whatever you're aroused to do that's within your reach, so it can be the horror of the huge extinction event that's going on. Can also be the ignition point inside human beings. To the extent that it's not becoming that, I have fear for our souls. I have fear for our humanity. I have fear for the fact that we don't seem to be fully becoming human. We're more like human doings than human beings. We just endlessly do instead of discovering the full measure of what it is to have this kind of consciousness in a mortal body on an astonishing earth.
Yeah, it is an incredible opportunity that I think requires deeper reflection and exploration, especially at this moment. And you just mentioned this idea of nothing has ever ended. And your latest book, A Fire Runs Through All Things, it focuses on Zen Koans as this tool for facing the climate crisis, which a Zen Koan endlessly opens. It's an unending adventure, I think you said in one of your books or something like that. For our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar, can you explain sort of what a Zen Koan is and why you think it's sort of useful in this application of the climate conversation?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what we call a Zen Koan, that word translates roughly as public case. So a case, an example, not quite like case law, although every single koan contains the Buddha Dharma, but in the most ordinary of words, ordinary looking of words, because it looks like a kind of answer to a question doesn't quite immediately register. How is that the answer to the question? Inside a little moment of a narrative encounter between a teacher and someone who comes with a question, usually a student or a monk or a nun or whatever. Okay, so, or an emperor in some cases. The emperors turn out to be, when they engage with Zen masters, they turn out to be rather foolish people. It might surprise you. Doesn't really surprise. So there's these little moments that were oral. It was an example, it was a moment of oral conversation. Someone wrote them down. Someone nearby remembered them and thought, that's valuable, I'll write that down. And so records of these encounters began to develop. And in time, they accumulated lots of commentaries and poems were written to accompany them, all of which is, in a sense, exploring that ever-unfolding aspect of a koan, because they never, ever stop opening. So let me give you an example of one. And this is a question that people often take up as a first koan. It's simply this question: what is my original face or your original face before even your parents were born? Okay, so that immediately places you in a very strange relationship to time, in a very useful way. So, original face is very personal. You know, face is what every human being's eyes go to read the situation of another human being. A face, such tiny set of variables, is somehow so particular in every single human case, every single human face. And so, face is very personal. You can also read it slightly as face, we maintain a kind of face. We save face. We save the face of someone else. We make them as comfortable as possible, help them save face. All of that goes along with the word face. But it's also saying, what is my true face? It's sort of essentially asking, what is this self? Because that is the great enduring question. Before even my parents were born. So now we're in a place where I have a life that begins and despite my best efforts, will end. I'm mortal. That word should be brought back. Human beings used to be described as mortals. It's very, very useful fact. So within that element or that layer of reality, what else is true? What is my original face before even my parents were born? And that, I'm not going to give you any kind of direct response to that, but I would invite you, if you want to explore this, take some time, go outside and just let something draw your attention, like it could be a single leaf. Now give yourself as much time as you can possibly give, at least 5 minutes, maybe 10, to look at that leaf as if for the first time and keep looking at it and keep looking at it until you can not only see your original face, but you can see the entire universe is there by implication in that single leaf. It could not exist without the entire universe in its entire unfolding up to now. So that's one way of understanding how we have a very simple linear sense of time, while at the same time the very notion of interconnectedness starts to draw us out and out and out into a very widely embodied sense of time. Indigenous sense of time here in Australia, which I do talk about in the book quite a lot because it is like a kind of template for a human being, the experience of human beings across 60,000 plus years in one place. That's the only example on earth of one continuous relationship to place. And so the body of wisdom that is embedded in Indigenous understanding has a really strong sense of the immediacy of time where you're breathing right now, this very breath, and the utterly extensive relationship of that all the way back through no time, non-linear time. That is very valuable if you're going to take up the koan. What is my original face before even my parents were born? It's drawing us into that one body of living reality, one and closer, much closer to thinking along with the earth rather than thinking about the earth as if it's an object outside us. You'll find your original face wherever your heart is truly open. You'll find it.
That's incredible. I'm definitely going to do that this weekend. I'm going to go to my local trail and think about that for a bit. And that kind of leads on to one other question I wanted to talk about, because I think your background's really interesting as a Zen teacher, but also with this connection with Indigenous Australian knowledge. Like, how have those two areas of study and practice sort of come together to influence how you think about, I guess, your relationship with nature or some of the things we've discussed today?
Okay. That's almost hard to sort out because I think it probably stems back to the fact that I didn't wear shoes till I was 7. It does come back to things like that because it has that, my childhood in North Queensland, you didn't have to wear shoes, so beside the point. So in a sense, walking on the earth in a really richly receptive kind of environment, rainforest and coral reefs as they were then. This breaks my heart to have to say as they were then. Just an extremely beautiful, generous kind of sense of the natural world, utterly surrounding where I was. And so I also had a lot of Aboriginal classmates in my school. And so that was just an ordinary fact of life. And they were fun to play with. They were very interesting people to play with. They had a strong sense, a spirited sense of humour and of unquestionable belonging right where they were. Perhaps that's part of it, but I know that right through I'm trying to think how long it actually lasted. For the last 30 years of my life or more, I had walked very closely with one particular elder, Uncle Max Harrison, his tribal name Dullamunmun, a dear, dear human being who COVID took from us, to my great, great regret. But Uncle Max just had a wonderful way. He's a fully initiated man, by the way, which is not commonplace on the south coast of New South Wales or south coast of Australia. It was a very lucky and unusual fact. And so he was able to walk in both worlds at once, so to speak. and to let you in. And when I say letting you in, just like a koan takes a moment or two, or maybe a lifetime or two, to really let you in, it was like that with Indigenous teaching as well. If you went for a walk on country, that's country is a whole other matter. Doesn't mean countryside. It doesn't mean the country. Country is a way of saying the entire human place template of understanding. And it has mythological depth, it has huge amount of immediate practical knowledge, all completely part of one thing. And it really is the invitation to think along with the earth. You know, I come back to that because that's what you begin to learn to do. But every time I was out in country, on country with Uncle Max, in a teaching situation where he'd be leading a party of people through the bush, as we call it, and just, you couldn't get very far. You maybe get 100 yards in one walk because there's so much teaching in every detail. The sense of the sacred was so immediate and practical at once. That was what was so beautiful, is so beautiful about that teaching. Let me give you an example of a teaching, a moment like that. We were walking after a Zen retreat, so everybody was in a pretty deep state. He came and joined us at the end of that retreat, sat with us in meditation, and then off we went on a walk on country. We came to a point where we'd come to the point where the path would cross the creek and go up the other side of a little creek. And on the other side of that creek was a sign saying, private property, no entry. And he stopped and he said, he just asked a simple question, where's the private property? And there was no possible way to identify anything that was not entirely shared. Nothing. Everything was alive and was interrelated and was sharing itself with everything else. And the idea of private property was suddenly so weird, so stark. There was actually a little creeper growing across that sign trying to sort of repair it back into reality. But there it was, a ridiculous statement. And that is where the power of indigenous natural connectedness, natural sense of if you're not in connectedness, you're not in reality, is so valuable. Such a, if we deafen ourselves, if we lose an appropriately humble curiosity and interest in all of that depth of innate connectedness and unquestioned, simple, straightforward connected understanding, we're idiots. It's idiotic not to turn towards it and say, what do I need to know? What do we need to know at this point that we're so badly missing? And so it has been a huge privilege for me. I dedicated the book to his memory. Huge privilege to walk and co-teach with him at different points in all sorts of strange contexts and just share in that great sort of gift of understanding that if you, in a sense, lower your grasping mind, it comes in, the understanding comes in with relative ease. And so I feel as though that template of not just survival, but flourishing in place across huge stretches of climate change in one place, that whole mythos, just going back to the idea of story, has so much to offer, so much to help generate the kind of shared story we now need to richly imagine ourselves into if we're going to survive our own alienation from the earth.
And to kind of bring our conversation to a close, there was a piece you had written for Tricycle where you had a line from the former U.S. poet laureate Robert Haas. It said, we are the only protectors, and we are what needs to be protected, and we are what it needs to be protected from." Which is almost like a little koan in and of itself to ponder that. When we think about this story, when we think about this recognition of interdependence and this existence of interbeing, do you feel hopeful about this? Do you have hope that we'll figure this out? Are there signs that get you excited that we're getting closer?
I guess we're all waiting to see. Waiting to see just what we turn out to be made of as human beings. I would say that quite beautiful formulation of Robert Haas, of his making, we are the only protectors because we are the ones who did the damage. And we have it in us to do further damage or to mitigate the damage. So we are the only protectors. The impact of our opposable thumb can be visible from space now. You can see the changes we have wrought. Okay, and we are what needs to be protected because it's coming down on us, and it comes down on us both as our responsibility but also as our fate. It comes down on us. But then he adds that third one, which puts everything back into a fresh perspective, and we are what it needs to be protected from. Now, you could see that as a kind of inescapable, everywhere you look, there's a problem. Or you could see it as everywhere you look, there are the three factors that need to be brought together. We are the protectors, we need to be protected from the harm, and we need to acknowledge what it is in us that is permitting, with apparent impunity of some kind, huge amounts of damage. So that can be the mainspring. Those three coming together at every point can be the mainspring of what is to be done, what is to be found in us, what is to be done and brought forward at every point that we can in whatever dilemma is facing us. Those are the three parameters of our situation, where the source of harm, the need to moderate harm to ourselves, and the need to see how deeply harmful we're able to be, all at once. So I guess it's whether it's whether it's hopeful or not, I don't know. I don't know that I can say. I do know I can say that despair is not an option, because that's signing off. That's consigning the fate of the earth to something too egregious, too impossible to contemplate. But whether or not we can get past the kinds of chaotic way the world is turning right now and manage to steer a course of deep adaptation, much, much deeper adaptation to our reality, I don't know. And one of the things I am worried about is the fact that our political imagination is not deep enough. Our historical imagination is not deep enough. It's about as long as one human lifetime. That's not long enough. You know, the fact that we can't remember, we don't have a long, strong sense of where this moment came from. And so that's actually part of turn things while turning with things. We need to not turn away, and we need to be constantly facing the hard facts and letting them hurt, letting them rouse what they need to rouse, which is that fierce protective love. And apart from that, I just deeply, deeply hoping that we're not going to be our own final victims of ignorance.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really interesting question to ponder as we wrap the episode of this three layers of need to be protected. We're the only protectors, but we also need to be protected from ourselves in a lot of way. And if we can lean into that awareness, sort of both the things that hurt and the things that are hopeful, hopefully will spur the action that's necessary. So thank you so much, Susan, for joining us today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I think this is going to add a lot to the discussion that we've had with a lot of amazing guests, including yourself on the podcast. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Rick. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.